You know, there's a memory from my childhood that I still can't shake. It happened when I was around 10 years old, in the little town where I grew up. It was the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened. But there was one house, the old Ramsey house, that every kid in the neighborhood avoided. The Ramsey house sat at the end of an overgrown gravel road, hidden by thick trees and surrounded by rusty chain-link fences. Its windows were always dark, its paint peeling, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds taller than me. Kids at school told stories about it, of course. They said it was haunted, that a little girl named Sarah had died in there decades ago. They'd say if you knocked on the door 3 times, she'd answer. One day, my friend Danny and I dared each other to check it out. Danny was the adventurous type, always getting us into trouble. I was nervous, but I couldn't back down, or he'd never let me hear the end of it. So, one evening just before sunset, we snuck out and made our way to the Ramsey house. We slipped through a gap in the fence and approached the front steps, which creaked under our weight. Danny whispered, "You go first," but I could see he was as scared as I was. I held my breath, reached out, and knocked on the door 3 times. Nothing happened. I laughed nervously, feeling silly for even being scared. But then we heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from inside, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. We stared at each other, eyes wide, before the tapping got louder. It was coming toward us like footsteps, but lighter, almost like a child's steps. "Let's go," I whispered, turning to leave, but Danny grabbed my arm. "Wait," he said. "It's probably just the wind." But we both knew that wasn't true. Then, out of nowhere, the door creaked open, just a crack. Through the gap, I saw a dark hallway leading into pitch-black shadows. My heart pounded as I stared, feeling like something, or someone, was watching us from that darkness. Danny took a step forward, trying to peek inside, but I pulled him back. "Don't," I whispered. But he shrugged me off, saying, "Come on, it's just a house." Before I could stop him, he slipped through the door. I waited on the porch, my heart racing, hoping he'd just run back out, laughing. But a minute passed, and I didn't hear a thing. Then 2 minutes, and still nothing. I was about to go after him when I heard it, the faint sound of a little girl's voice singing from somewhere inside. My blood turned cold. I knew Danny didn't sing. He could barely carry a tune. But that voice kept getting louder, moving closer. I stood frozen until I saw her, a pale, shadowy figure of a little girl standing at the end of the hallway, staring straight at me. Then she smiled. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen on the porch, staring into the darkness of that hallway. The girl's smile was unsettling, like she knew something I didn't. My instinct was to run, but I couldn't leave Danny behind. So, with my heart pounding, I forced myself to take a step inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air grew cold, colder than any winter night I'd ever felt. Each step I took echoed in the eerie silence. My breath fogged in front of me, and shadows seemed to stretch along the walls, bending toward me like they were watching. "Danny?" I whispered, my voice barely more than a whimper. No response. Then I saw it, the faint glow of a flashlight lying in the middle of the hallway. I walked over, picked it up, and saw it was still on, its beam pointing toward an open doorway just down the hall. It led into a small room, dimly lit and covered in layers of dust. As I shone the light inside, I nearly dropped it in horror. There, in the corner, was Danny. He was sitting on the floor, staring straight ahead with a vacant look in his eyes, like he was in some sort of trance, His face was pale, his mouth slightly open, but he didn't respond when I called his name. I stepped closer, reaching out to shake him, and that's when I heard it. The soft sound of a child's laughter echoing from the darkness. I whipped around, shining the flashlight behind me, but there was nothing there, just shadows shifting along the walls. When I turned back to Danny, he was staring directly at me now, his expression blank and wrong somehow. "Danny, come on, let's go!" I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him up, but he didn't budge. His gaze was fixed over my shoulder, and he muttered in a voice that barely sounded like his own, "She doesn't want us to leave." A chill crawled up my spine, and I turned slowly, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There, standing in the doorway, was the little girl. Her pale skin looked almost translucent in the dim light, her eyes wide and dark, staring right at me. Her mouth stretched into that unsettling smile, too wide, almost as if it weren't meant to be on her face. "Play with me," she whispered, her voice a soft, chilling echo that sent my heart racing. She stepped closer, reaching out a hand, and that's when I noticed her fingers, long, thin, and almost claw-like, as if they were something out of a nightmare. I stumbled back, pulling Danny with me, but he barely moved, his gaze locked on her. She kept coming closer, her smile growing wider, revealing rows of teeth that seemed too sharp, too many. I felt trapped, paralyzed with fear as she stretched her hand out toward us. Desperate, I pulled with all my strength, and finally, Danny seemed to snap out of his trance. He blinked, looked at me, and then at the girl. Without a word, we both scrambled to our feet and bolted down the hallway, my flashlight flickering as we ran. We could hear her footsteps behind us, light but fast, chasing us down, her laughter echoing through the empty house. Just as we reached the door, it slammed shut in front of us, trapping us inside. I threw myself against it, pounding and screaming, but it wouldn't budge. And then, everything went silent. The laughter stopped, the footsteps faded, and the cold lifted. I turned to Danny, and he looked at me, his face as pale as mine, both of us too scared to speak. Slowly, I reached for the doorknob, and to my relief, it turned. We stumbled out of the house, not daring to look back as we ran all the way home. To this day, I don't know what we saw in there, and I haven't spoken to Danny about it since. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that laughter and feel a chill, like she's still out there, waiting.